Otherkins are human. Consciousness is expanding and people are starting to question more, what is a human?
I definitely believe I'm a mermaid.
This lifestyle is kind of like a coloring book where she hands me the lines and I can just fill them in with whatever color I want.
I like to think I'm a 24/7 kitten.
My name is Tony and I'm a human pup.
I'm Andrew. I'm Tony's husband and trainer.
Today's topic is trans species. Yes, this is an actual thing, an actual issue, and it is growing in popularity. Any light searching in the tubes of you land, world, you will find that this is actually something that many people struggle with. Case in point, remove my genitals to make me a genderless alien. The description says that he has already spent $60,000 at the time of this video, which is in 2017, trying to transform himself into a genderless alien. Here's another one. This man's life as a pup. This person identifies as a dog. This one identifies as a cat. This one identifies as a 6-year-old girl. This guy identifies as a hobbit, and this girl identifies as a gender fluid demon doll. It's hard to tell which one of these I find more shocking over the others. Now, I am still learning about this, but there is a word for this other than trans species. They are called otherkin, which are people who socially and spiritually identify as not entirely human. And as you can see, this also applies to the fantasy realm. All they want to do is to find their true self. For me, honestly, this sounds like a strange double standard because they're trying to find their true self by basing their identity on something that isn't tethered to reality.
There is a certain aspect to life that is very game-like in that we make choices and our choices have consequences that affect things for ourselves and for those around us. But the key to understanding where we should make our choices and what the best use of our effort is pointed towards is to know what we do have control over and what we do not. And since we're using the example of live action role-playing, let's consider in a role-playing game what parameters we might have control over. If we were the dungeon master, we could have control over all of the parameters. Or the game designer has an even greater level of control. As the player, our control is far more limited. Now, when people actually play some sort of a role-playing game, the fun of it is that you get to create and dictate some of the parameters for your character that you do not have control over in your own life. And this is greatly centered around identity. So when you play the game, you can choose the characteristics of your character, the traits and abilities and the background and story, where they're from, their racial makeup, their physical stature, and all of these things have an impact on the results of the game. However, in our own lives, many of those parameters are precisely the things that we do not have control over. And so, while we do have agency and the ability to make choices and decisions, applying our choice and decision to the purpose of changing things that we have no control of is very foolish. And this is exemplified most clearly in the examples of these otherkin type people, which is a silly name, but that is the most extreme version, and the slightly less extreme versions of this similar behavior are found in things like transgenderism, and then maybe in the most mild forms is the literal LARPing that happens when people decide to live in an escapist world of fantasy instead of in pursuing something in reality. Now, I think that identifying what we can and cannot change is important, but we also have to consider how we make the decisions about where we apply our effort and energy. This is something where we need to be aware of, because we may well be acting exactly like some of these people with these bizarre lifestyle choices, but because the choices that we are making are much more mundane, more socially acceptable, and perhaps even virtuous in some ways, we are blind to the fact that we're making use of the same mechanism to choose how we build our identities. I'm going to use an example from childhood. Probably the normal thing for most kids is that they're going to choose to root for the sports teams that are local to their area. You know, whether it's college or professional sports, if it's a state or a city, or the local team is the norm. Now, there may be some exceptions, like if your parents were from another area and they had a strong loyalty to a particular team, you might root for that team. So where I lived in New England, most of the natives rooted for the Patriots, they rooted for the Red Sox. And then you'd have maybe some person who's had a relative, or their dad was from New York, and so they're going to root for the Yankees instead. And that was like pretty typical. But there was always some kid who decided that he would choose as his favorite team the currently winningest team, or last year's champions, or the projected greatest champion or something. And what was the purpose of doing this? It was simply for the sake of, in relation to other people, they would have an aspect of superiority. They would have something that set them apart and made them unique. If you were a Patriots fan in the 90s, it wasn't the greatest experience, but at least we could all be in it together. If you decided that your favorite team was going to be the Dallas Cowboys instead, they had a great run of success during that time period. So you could be the one who would get to lord it over everyone else that your team is the greatest. And this would give you some sort of meaningful boost to your ego. But when you grow up, that team may well decide to be terrible, and then you're stuck with this decision of, are you going to change your loyalties? You've invested your time and energy into this one franchise. It has no connection to you in that it represents the place where you grew up, and you have no connection to that other city far away. The only thing that you really liked about that city was that they had a winning football team. It's very important as people begin to search for meaning in their lives, they make conscious decisions about how they're going to pursue that search for meaning. And seeking religion or spiritual understanding or something like that, it is very easy to simply go online, look at the comparisons, the arguments people are saying, and sort of just pick what seems to be the greatest and the best version of what that is. Or certainly, for the same reason at least, you will write off without consideration the things that people say are the worst and the most terrible. And so I would say that in this sort of example, if a person has no religious tradition to draw on personally, or they have become separated from whatever they grew up believing or understanding, if they are seeking to know Christianity from a supposedly neutral position, there is a lot of appeal to things like Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, because they have an institutional claim of superiority in being the oldest, the most consistent, most authentic. And by choosing that as your franchise, if you will, you instantly gain credibility and a boost to your ego, and you may be unaware of this. Because you may think that it is simply because you're choosing based on what is the most correct. This desire to gain a robust identity by identifying yourself with a great institution is a false claim, because really what you have done is you have used your own ability to choose for yourself as the vehicle through which you came to that conclusion. And so what you are putting at the head is actually your free choice to decide for yourself what branch of religion you want to affiliate yourself with. And so you've actually adopted the sort of Protestant mindset that many of those within the Orthodox, Catholic, and more traditional communities would reject. That is why, for many people, whether they realize it or not, they're LARPing if in their desire to be a part of that community, because there's no basis on which they would choose that other than a perceived superiority and the belief that you have the ability to choose. And this is not to say it's only the Orthodox and the Catholic, because I see the same thing when I go on Twitter and there are people who are 1689 Reformed Baptist confessional identified people, and that is their identity. They believe that that is the most perfect doctrine was settled on in that confession, or it could be the Westminster Confession, or Scottish Presbyterianism, or your Wesleyan tradition. And there's people for all these different stripes and varieties of Christianity who have all decided that some point in the past perfection was achieved, and they may have very good personal reasons for affiliating themselves with that. But when they resort to this sort of institutional power as their reason for defending that choice, they put themselves in a weak position. It's not based in anything other than your own choice. And if we would say that somebody is wrong to choose to live as a genderless alien, or as some sort of an animal, or an opposite gender, or any other fantasy type character, because it's not based in any reality, then why would we affirm that choice for something good, becoming a Christian, if the means to get there is the same? In other words, what we're doing is we're saying that the ends justify the means, but the problem is the means. So we need to be very careful. Now, I would say that somebody like Jonathan Pajot has a very legitimate claim to his Orthodox faith because he was a visual artist. His identity was very much tied to that, and he found meaning and significance through the Orthodox expression of the visual arts. Now, for me personally, the fact that I would never be allowed to play the musical instruments that I am comfortable with and enjoy playing in the service, that could be a detrimental point, especially considering that there are people who have told me that, they were blessed by the experience of having me play music. And not even that it was anything that I particularly enjoyed. Oftentimes it was when I thought, I didn't do so great, or it wasn't particularly meaningful, but somehow it's a meaningful experience to others. And so how do we build our identity? Well, it has to be, at least to some extent, founded in the things that we do not control, the things that are externally verifiable and that we can learn from others. Who your parents are and the way that they raised you, it has to be a part of your decision. Now, it doesn't mean you have to do what they did, because if part of your upbringing was that your parents raised you terribly and were abusive, then it would make a lot of sense for you to try to find some system to integrate yourself in that is very different from whatever the system that they had. But things like culture and where you were born and the country that you lived in and what was going on in the formative years of your life, those are all important aspects of who you are that you really cannot change. You have to look at your character sheet, essentially, and you have to decide, will I put all of my effort and energy into trying to play this game as a type of character for which I'm extremely ill-suited, which will be a frustrating experience, or will I instead look at what my strengths are and my abilities and lean into that and try to find the path that will give me the greatest chance of success and victory. And it's not to say that any of these things are wrong in and of themselves, but the way that we approach them is important, and we have to be cognizant of why we make these decisions. And even if it's absolutely necessary to invest that level of commitment, because I can enjoy stories about aliens without deciding that I need to become one. I can enjoy studying wildlife without deciding that I have to embody that physically in some way. The more we seek to find our identity that is not simply in who we think we are, who we desire to be, but is based on the things that we didn't control, the circumstance that we came from, and in a spiritual sense, the revelation that we get from God and who He tells us about who we are, that is what's going to help us to find the best possible place for us to be. And if you think that there's a certain type of church that's awful and their theology's the worst because you've read a bunch of comparisons on the internet, well, chances are there's still going to be good people in one of those churches. There's probably people that you can learn from in every church. But more importantly, there's probably people that you could bless in every church. And it may well be that it would be better for you to go and minister and volunteer at a church that you have serious questions about their motivation or theological beliefs, rather than to simply try to find the church experience that gives you the most fulfilling experience. Because ultimately, it is better to give than to receive. Instead of seeking to create an identity for ourselves, we should be trying to build and better the identity of those around us and help them to become the best characters in their own story. And I understand the appeal of wanting to live in the world of swords and sorcery, but unfortunately we live in a world of electronics and concrete and glass and plastic. It's not the most exciting because it's so common to us. But the only reason why we look back on those other times with such wonder and joy is because of the people who made those experiences meaningful.